Yeah, all right. No, it's been a while. But welcome back to another field guide. Today we're going to be talking about something that I feel like a lot of people probably be interested in learning the history of, just because it's such a common kind of like menswear item these days. I feel like every brand makes some version of a jungle jacket. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a jungle jacket. Today we're going to walk through kind of the history and origins of the jungle jacket and kind of show you where it came from. We're first going to start with what's kind of colloquially called like a first pattern. Now this is like a thing that happens a lot in military collecting, where basically patterns change over time, pattern specs change, but all of these jackets here, they're all the same jacket. As far as the military is concerned, they are all, tropical combat jackets. Collectors years later need to kind of make some kind of differential about, the little changes that happen. And some of them are big changes too, right? These are changes in the spec, they do matter. But when I refer to things as like a first pattern, second pattern, third, fourth pattern, that's not real. That's a made up collector thing. That said, we're talking about the first pattern. So this is the first version. This is adopted, June of 1963. And this is, very much a response to the widening war in Vietnam. The U.S. still doesn't have, combat ground forces in Vietnam, but they do have advisors, right? So these are mostly special forces advisors, like Green Berets, who are in country working with the South Vietnamese. The US government, they need a dedicated tropical combat uniform, something that makes sense in the jungle, something that's lightweight. Basically, during World War II, the US Army slowly started to, make uniforms that were dedicated for both combat and also combat in different climates. For the vast majority of World War II, any kind of tropical combat, South Pacific, kind of what's called kind of the PTO, right? All of that's being fought essentially in fatigue uniforms, or HBTs. Not super breathable, was found to be lacking. So they're working on it, right? But then, end of hostilities in World War II, they kind of shelve it, right? There's some trials in the 1950s in Panama, again, trying to figure out what does a tropical uniform look like for the U.S. Army. But it's really not until U.S. involvement in Vietnam starts to ramp up that they kind of start saying, okay, we need to make a tropical kind of uniform, right? Today we're going to be talking about the jackets because that's kind of what matters for again kind of a more fashion audience. But this is part of a whole uniform, right? So there are matching trousers that go with everything we're about to talk about. Before we get to the first pattern, jungle jacket, we need to talk about some of the jackets that kind of inform the design before the 1960s, right? So we're going to go back in time a little bit to World War II. And you'll see right away when I kind of show you this first jacket, how this is clearly informing the jungle jacket that comes in the 1960s. So the first one is going to be your 1942 parachutist jacket, M42 paratrooper jacket. It already starts to have a lot of the hallmarks that you're going to see with the jungle jacket. So first off, you're going to have these slanted pockets. So slanted pockets, these are snap closure right here, and they're bellowed, right? You can see there's a pleat in the center of the pocket. It's designed for pockets. It's super simple, kind of shirt collar design. This is a zip front. It ends kind of high, right, which is also kind of important. You'll see it later, because it's meant to be worn outside of the trousers. You can really see the beginnings of the jungle jacket here, right? I mean, just look at it. We have the slanted pockets. We even have the pen opening pockets. The top of the pockets are open. That will be a design feature that's carried throughout the jungle jacket as well. That's number one, right? So this is a jacket that was used by paratroopers throughout World War II, kind of phased out with the introduction of the M43 field jacket. First pattern doesn't have a belt, but there are some prototype jungle jackets that do have a very similar belt model to this as well. The way that the Army describes the need for a tropical uniform is they use the term bush jacket, right? So they're looking for a bush jacket design. Now, when they're referring to a bush jacket, really that's something that is much more common in the British Army and was used, I mean, when you think about the British Army, the British Empire, they're kind of, all over the globe. They need uniforms that kind of work everywhere. This is an example of a World War II British Indian Army jungle bush jacket. There's some origin point here for the jacket over here, right? It's super simple, lightweight, 4 pockets, meant to be worn outside the trousers. Again, just like super, super easy, breathable, and like very, kind of utilitarian. So now let's actually talk about the first pattern jacket, right? There's a few famous photographs of like advisors in Vietnam, and like they're gonna be wearing this version, right? There's like the famous cover of Life magazine with like a captain who's walking through a rice paddy. He's wearing like a first pattern, which I don't have an original first pattern to show you. There is one in the mail, but it's not here. But we're gonna be talking about this one. This is a real McCoy's version. It's instructive that like the real McCoys and other reproduction brands, they make first patterns because those are the rarest of the jungle jacket designs. They demand the most on the collector's market because of that. The first thing like you'll notice is like all of the buttons are exposed except for the front.
Lieutenant Dan wears, right? Maybe I'm wrong.
He's wearing like a later model. We'll have to like pull a photo. I think Elias in Platoon wears one. Other things to note about the jungle jacket is kind of just the strange kind of inside closure as well. This is really a holdover from World War II. It's called a gas flap. Now, I'm gonna say something like I don't really have any, like I don't know for sure. My gut on this is that, while it's the same style as a gas flap, I think this was much more for like wind resistance than anything else, right? So it's like kind of creating like a storm front. It's like called a gas flap, and again, that's like kind of left over from World War II, where like they would basically impregnate fabric with like a chemical compound to prevent gas from kind of getting to your skin if in case of a gas attack. And they had these like kind of double closures on jackets, on pants, things of that nature. I think this is much more like to prevent wind. The U.S. Army hasn't always like, how do I say this? The British Army, for example, like is very attuned to the idea of like wind resistance in their uniforms, right? Everything is made from like a super, super densely woven cotton, gabardine, something of that nature. The U.S. doesn't call things windproof, but this is an example of something that's like very nicely, wind resistant. I mean, this is also kind of interesting here. We can kind of take a look at the instruction label. But again, it actually kind of notes some of the things that I said, right? Like wearing it outside of the trousers, like is an important element here. That is not just for like ease of pockets, but it's also the idea of like airflow, right? Like this is a uniform that's supposed to be worn in like incredibly hot and humid temperatures. The idea is to like allow yourself to breathe. Then in August of 1964, what we'll call the second pattern is adopted. And you'll see right away some of the changes that are made, and we'll walk through why those changes are made. The sleeves have been shortened. This is kind of, you can see this happening in Vietnam, mostly with like guys who are stationed on air bases, kind of in rear areas, right, where it's like you really don't need to roll your sleeves down. And then also the bottom pockets have been removed. Now the reason for that is to allow them to be tucked into trousers and kind of present like a neat and kind of orderly appearance. But right away, like you'll notice some changes. First big one is now the pockets are covered. No more exposed buttons. But the pockets kind of, they remain the same. Why did they change over from exposed buttons to covered buttons? A, buttons are shiny. Like even like, these plastic ones, right? They're gonna like have some reflective quality. Number two, and probably more importantly, is like this really gets snagged on shit. Brush, but also just like your gear, right? Like, you're putting your gear on, suspenders, belt, all of that stuff. Like stuff is getting caught on these buttons. And then, we still have the epaulettes on here. We still have the side adjusters on here as well. So yeah, the big thing is that we are now covering the buttons. Still made from a 5 ounce poplin, as this one is as well. After World War II, they try to streamline sizing. By they, I mean the US military. You're stepping away from kind of using chest and like waist sizes, and instead starting to move to size ranges, like kind of what we would call like, small, medium, large, right? But then there's also an added height component, right? So there's a short, there's a regular, there's a long. This one, for example, is a regular medium. So again, like kind of just like your average, like this is like a very average size. Also, like if you're looking to buy these to wear casually, which like a lot of people are, I comfortably wear like a medium regular. I could go medium short depending on kind of how I want it to fit, but medium is like pretty good. The larges are pretty big. And the extra larges are very big. This is an extra large, for example, which is why he's a little taller than me today.
Was it ever frowned upon to modify uniforms?
Well,
or was it kind of like,
yeah,
who cares?
There were certain modifications that, like, are made to these jackets that, kind of are in line with like kind of general military discipline and like decorum, right? Or like kind of like dress practice. So like, for example, like, wanting to tuck this in to your trousers to present like a more like orderly, like kind of business-like appearance, like that kind of makes sense. Taking the sleeves off if you're like working in like a desk job on an Air Force base in South Vietnam, basically sitting in maybe in air conditioning most of the day, but like also not going out into the bush. Again, kind of fine. I'm pretty sure this is a very early reproduction. You can see it's kind of been hand camouflaged, not something that's like super common to see. Also, the bottom pocket's removed as well, so you can tuck them into the trousers. This is a practice that you see in World War II with the Marine Corps, because they have the P-41 tops that have one chest pocket and two skirt pockets. And you see a bunch of guys either like tucking them in with the pockets or sometimes in the post-war years like removing the pockets altogether. Late 1966, December 1966, the third pattern is introduced. This is where things can get a little complicated. This would still be a third pattern, but there are some third patterns that do not have certain features to this. This is really like the beginning of the jungle jacket that you're going to see throughout Vietnam, kind of worn by Marines, airmen, soldiers, right? Still being made from a wind-resistant poplin, but now we still have the covered buttons. We have removed the gas flap from the inside, right? We have removed the side waist adjusters. We have removed the epaulettes from the shoulders. It's like we have a jacket. We got 4 pockets, covered buttons. We have button closed, gusset cuff. Now, here's the thing that kind of makes it a little different. This one also has a back yoke. Now, there's some third patterns that do not have the back yoke. Some people refer to the jackets that are poplin, have everything like this with no back yoke as a third pattern, and then the next jacket has a fourth pattern, and then there's a fifth, so we're just gonna, for this, we're just gonna stick with referring to this as like kind of like the wide third pattern, right? So that's gonna include anything that's kind of poplin made, and also kind of has the back yoke. The color here, it's all OG 107, right? So like when you think about like OG 107 fatigues, pants, shirts, this is like the new green of the Army that they come out with in the 1950s. That's the standardized color for the jungle uniform as well. Now that I said that, with the third pattern, there is the slow introduction of ERDL camouflage as well. ERDL stands for, and we'll drop it here because I don't remember what it is, but it's like Engineer Research Development Laboratory. I'm gonna say that that's what it is. I'm gonna double check that. If it's not that, then we'll cut this section. It's a 1948 camouflage pattern that, basically the Army developed. It looks very similar to M81 Woodland, and we'll get to it in a minute when we get to the next version of the jacket. In October of 1967, the jungle jacket becomes the general duty uniform for all military stationed in Southeast Asia and also some other climates as well, like in South America. But this has now become standardized. If you're going over to Vietnam, you're probably wearing this. So moving right along, we're now going to get to what is sometimes called the fourth pattern. Right, so this is now late 1967. We've made kind of our last changes here, a ripstop version, right? So we're changing the fabric. So basically everything else is staying the same. There's certain things like, like we still have the back yoke. What ripstop is, I believe we have a great video that describes what ripstop is, which we can link here, right? Harlan did a video on ripstop, right? Did it come out yet? So basically what ripstop is, right, is you have a again, like a cotton poplin, but now instead of just straight cotton, we now have woven in nylon as well, right? So basically what that means is like once there's like a tear or a rip, it won't like completely unravel. They also start to produce it in ERDL. You'll hear like sometimes people like refer to ERDL as like ERDL. Like that's like someone who like learned this stuff on the internet and like never talked to anybody about it. Like it's referred to as ERDL if you're being a snob like me. So this is the green dominant version. We'll drop a photo here of the brown dominant ERDL. These are kind of being made side by side. I love this one. I mean, it's so cool. I mean, with like the lime, kind of like that lime green color in there. It kind of always reminds me of like Stewart's lime soda like bottle when I was a kid. You can see that it's like very similar to M81 Woodland, but it's not, right? So the colors are different. The brown dominant version is going to look closer. As you can see, this is a much smaller pattern too than the Woodland. They're blowing up Erdl, make it bigger. The sizes are all bigger, and they're rotating it. And that's what becomes kind of the classic M81 Woodland that everybody knows. You see the Erdl a little bit more with like Marines in like 1969, 1970, 71, where like the OG-107 kind of stays with the Army throughout the war. Rangers, LRP like detachments, like they're getting the camo ones. But like kind of like your regular kind of ground pounder infantry guys in the Army, they're sticking with the OG-107 by and large. Again, there's like some variation to that. Again, kind of an interesting thing about Vietnam is it's a very different kind of conflict, obviously, to World War II. And with that, you have like a lot of rotation, right? So like guys are being sent over to Vietnam and, you know, either for 12 or 13 months each, right? And then they're coming home.
Am I in the shot?
Yes.
Hi, people.
Like they're going through these uniforms at a much like more intense clip than say like Europe and the ETO. Like these are basically disposable, which is why like a lot of them like are sterile. And by sterile, I mean like there's no name tapes on them. There's no like rank insignia. But I do have a cool one here though, like, and this kind of as like we like round it out and kind of finish this. This is another like fourth pattern. And this is kind of cool because this is a kind of variation that you do see overseas, which is that this is like direct embroidery on here instead of kind of the name tapes, right? Like this is just embroidered right onto the jacket, you know, just like that kind of like super simple direct embroidery. But like I like this one a lot. It's cool for that. 1971, like they're making a desert version that never really, you know, fully, you know, materializes because it's not needed. You know, the U.S. Army mostly working out of the Natick laboratories up in Massachusetts. They're trying to figure out different versions of this. After Vietnam, these are like slowly retired. There's like a few units in the professional army that like kind of hold on to them or modify them and use them, like mostly like ranger regiments. Again, mostly for training purposes. By the time like the invasion of Grenada rolls around in 1983, like by then like everyone's wearing BDUs, which would be like kind of the standard, very similar to the jungle jacket, except we've now kind of lost a lot of like the cool stuff about it, right? Like the pockets are still covered. They're not this cool shape anymore. They make a desert camo version. Whatever. That's not for today. We're not talking about BDUs. Okay, so we've like covered a lot of like the history of these jackets like within the military context, right? But like kind of as I started this video, I was saying that like this is like a very like common jacket in like menswear. For as long as I've been getting dressed, basically, like I've seen like some kind of content about like how it's like a great spring jacket, all of that, and like there's plenty of photos of like Dennis Hopper in the 1960s wearing one. Joaquin Phoenix in Inherent Vice wears one. Like these were very common kind of like late 1960s, early 1970s kind of like casual. I mean, again, like what kind of makes it such a cool jacket like for this is like, it kind of is like, it's kind of just a chore jacket, right? Like it's kind of like an army chore jacket that you can wear kind of in lieu of like a blazer, like in the summer, you know? So like you see a lot of guys like wearing them like that. Once you know like the shape, you'll see it kind of everywhere. I mean, I think that kind of like brings us to the end here. I think we've done a really good job, if I don't say so myself. But that kind of gives you the whole rundown of jungle jackets, and we'll be back soon with another field guide. Till then.